If We Were Giants, Chapter 12. Encountering tree folk while traveling through the woods was eerie. Kira didn't think she would ever get used to it. Everyone dressed in forest-friendly earth tones like Momi, so they blended right in with their surroundings. And while she used to fancy herself as someone who could quietly make her way through the trees, Kira had quickly learned she was no match for those who'd been born 200 feet off the ground in a windstorm. These people had grown up being part of the very fabric of the forest, just as much as the birds or the beasts or the rain that dripped from the leaves during the wet season. But mostly it was the way the tree folk acted, she supposed, the way they'd kept to themselves. Outside the tree folk community, when you passed a person on a trail or the road, they acknowledged you somehow, a smile, a wave, or perhaps just a quick nod, something that conveyed the message, hey there, we're both people who happen to be out walking near each other today. But the tree folk rarely recognized your presence at all unless you looked directly at them. Several times Kira had been working her way across a delicate branch, searching for handholds and testing the limb to see if it would carry her weight, blithely assuming she was the only one in this stretch of the forest, and then she would turn to see someone perched silently and nearly invisible right next to her on a neighboring branch. It gave her the willies every time. The person was never being weird or menacing or anything, just politely waiting for her to pass, so he didn't interfere with her navigation of the tree, but it was still unnerving. It was a bit better traversing the forest with Momi, as he was always better at spotting or perhaps sensing these fellow travelers, so at least he provided Kira some warning. She was walking on a thick branch behind him when he said, "Is this the best way to get to the clearing by the lake? The one with the rocky ridge at one end where a fisher might sit comfortably and throw out line?" Kira scrunched up her eyebrows. Why would he be asking me, she wondered. She opened her mouth to say she had no idea, and realized that Momi was actually talking to three men who were silently passing them among the branches. The oldest one, his beard flecked with gray, pointed into the distance. A fire last week made travel treacherous to the south. Better to loop around this way. The distance may be greater, but you will save time. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes, good travels. And then all three men slipped away into the heart of the forest without a sound. Kira thought about how this was typical of all interactions with tree folk who were not part of one's immediate inner circle. There was no animosity at all, no fear that these people might rob you or attack you or otherwise take any advantage from the encounter. But there was no warmth either, no sense that it mattered to them whether you reached your destination, and certainly no inclination that they might want to join you and chat along the way. The meeting happened by chance, information was exchanged, and then the meeting ended. But maybe that was starting to change a bit with this younger members of the tree folk. After all, Luan had his little group of friends that he ran around with, and while the more established Hook Hunter groups were made up of only family members, she knew that some of the newer ones held open trials once a year and would take new recruits from anywhere in the community as long as they had the skill and the nerve. Something on your mind? Momi said, pulling her out of her thoughts about the future of Tree Folk Society. Kira shook her head. So, are you taking me on a fishing trip? She asked. What? Oh, no. I just need to find that clearing with the lake. There is something I want to show you. We're almost there. Momi started to descend straight down the tree. Kira followed and felt the familiar twinges of relief as they got closer to the forest floor. She simply felt safer on the ground. The clearing was beautiful, and she did remember being here before, with the wand, daring each other to dive from atop the ridge. Her arrival in the treefolk community was mostly lost to her recollection in a hazy mix of confusing and fear and things that she didn't want to think or talk about at the time. But coming here was one of her first good memories of this place. The clearing allowed in much more sunlight than the dense forest, so it was one of the brightest spots Kira had seen in this area, and the surrounding trees gave the lake a beautiful emerald tint. The water was warm and felt like silk on bare skin, and if you floated on your back and stayed very still, The fish would start jumping all around you. It had felt like a welcome to her new home when that happened. If the people weren't overly enthusiastic about her arrival, at least the fish had accepted her as part of the landscape. This little oasis was also one of the few places where you saw tree folk from different families out in the open at the same time, but still, they were separate. Small groups of 3 or 4 huddled around the perimeter of the lake, throwing out fishing lines or wading in the water to cool off, or filling buckets with water to take back home. There were about 2 dozen tree folk out here now, scattered around the great open space. Kira watched them, the evening sun fading but still warm on her face, until Momi took her gently by the hand and led her to a jumbled pile of rocks at one end of the clearing. She couldn't imagine what was out here that he might want to show her. Kira gave the older man a look. "I'm not the bait for your next leopard trap, am I?" Momi chuckled. "No, Meerkat. I want to introduce you to something else." As they neared the rocks, Momi slowed. Then he dropped to one knee and Kira did the same. He pointed ahead and whispered to her, "Do you see that? Underneath that ledge of stone there?" Kara craned her neck forward and squinted. There was a dark mound a few feet high. "Is it a nest or a pot of some kind?" Mummy nodded. "It is." "And do you see anything unusual about it?" Kara tilted her head this way and that, studying the little knoll. "Not particularly. Looks like a small animal lives in there, or a family of them maybe. But nothing seems out of the ordinary." Mummy waved her forward. "Let's get a bit closer." As she got near, Kira saw the surface of the structure was moving. Writhing? How was that possible? What kind of material would do that with no discernible breeze? She took a few steps closer and saw... Wait, are those ants? Mummy smiled. "They are." Kira got even closer and dropped down to one knee again for a better view. That entire nest is made up of nothing but ants, and it looks like there were millions of them swarming around to make the structure. Their legs and bodies were linked together so tightly, it was no wonder it had taken her so long to notice them. She pointed at the middle of the mass. "What's inside?" "The queen and all of her eggs. These are the colony's most prized possessions, and every member does their part to protect them." "How long do they stay like that?" Mummy shrugged. "As long as they need to. In the morning, many will break away from the nest and go off in raiding parties to find food to bring back. Then, this area becomes unsuitable. The whole crew will move to a different part of the forest. They can reassemble into this protective covering for the queen at a moment's notice. The structure is called a bivouac, so I call these the bivouac ants. Every ant knows its job and does it well, and their colony prospers." Kira whistled in appreciation. "That's amazing." Mummy picked up a fallen branch. "Watch this." He leaned forward and gently poked the stick into the middle of the heap of ants. Kira was afraid he was going to squish hundreds of them, but the ants instantaneously rearranged themselves to allow the stick to dip right inside the structure, like it was sinking into a thick liquid. When the stick was sunk in about a foot or so, Mummy started to stir it around slowly. She was worried he would ruin the structure, scattering the ants everywhere, but the little insects shifted and moved together as if controlled by one mind, and so the stick was able to travel unimpeded through the mound. When Mummy let go, the stick stood straight up, and the ants, having absorbed the foreign object into their space. "Whoa," Kira breathed. Mummy nodded. "They are remarkable creatures." He gripped the stick again and pulled it out. It was clean, not a single ant clinging to its surface, and the hole it had created disappeared as the ants swarmed to fill the empty area. Soon it was a solid structure once again. Kira shook her head in wonder. She reached out hesitantly as if to touch the mound, but pulled her hand back. "It's beautiful in a way, isn't it? I mean, I never thought I would say that about a million bugs, but it is." Mummy gave her a long look with his kind eyes. "I think it's quite telling that you find beauty in this, young Kira." "Really? Why?" "You and I are similar," he said. "We're both outsiders." "Yes." She didn't need the reminder. "I figure," Mummy went on, "that after 10 years here, I've gotten as close to the tree folk as anyone from the outside is going to get." He gestured around the clearing, at the individual small groups of people clustered together. These people mean one another absolutely no harm, but neither are they in a rush to do for one another. Kira nodded. He was putting his finger on something that she could never talk to the family about. Yes, that's it exactly. She chewed on her lip, deep in thought, not entirely sure how to phrase the next part. And well, it's unusual, isn't it? I mean, you think that too, right? It's not just me. You and I find it unusual, but that's only because we were raised differently. She pieced it together. So they don't notice this might seem unusual because that's what they've always known. That's right. But Kira searched for the right words. Isn't it? I mean, no matter how you were raised, isn't it just easier to share? A more natural way for people to behave? When you're used to it, yes, of course, Momi said, but if it's not what you're accustomed to, sharing is scary. Scary? How? Again, Momi took the time to give her question real thought because people are worried they aren't going to get the amount they think they deserve. Right, but it never works out totally equal like that. Sometimes you get a little more, so next time you take a little less. It's just common sense. When Momi smiled, it was with his whole face, not just his mouth. The fact that you know all this so well, young Kira, that it is such a part of you, makes me think you used to live in a place that worked like this. He gestured at the Bivoviec structure. Kira snapped her head and look directly at him, a flash of resentment in her eyes. Is that why you brought me here? To trick me into talking about this? Momi shook his head gently. No, Meerkat, I only wanted to. Can't people just live their lives in peace? She stood up, brushed herself off. Maybe I prefer to be someplace where people don't have to share everything. Momi stood and tenderly placed his hands on her shoulders. I have lived for many years, Kira. I have traveled far and wide and experienced a great many things. I know that some communities, well, they come to an end, like a tree dying in the forest. And also, like a tree, they can cause a lot of damage when they fall. Suddenly, Kira felt very tired. That's the problem with not sharing your stories, with shutting them out. Momi gently brushed tears from her cheeks. It can be comforting to block bad memories, so comforting that it feels like the right thing to do. Kira nodded slowly. But when we do that, Momi continued, we also shut out all the good. And those are the things that help us heal. Kira's heart was racing, even though she was standing perfectly still. It felt like a torrent of memories was threatening to drown her, and Momi wanted to open the dam, but she would not let him. She pushed his hands away. You don't know anything about me, she said. Kira turned and fled into the forest.